books?
Well, I wouldn't be on television and I wouldn't be writing books unless I felt I had something to say that I didn't feel anyone else was saying or saying it adequately. And as far as people who put me on or people who listen, they must feel that that is the situation too. They must agree with that. And that's why I go on. In fact, it isn't a question, am I asking to go on, as you know.
No, indeed. We've
signed with you before.
Indeed.
Once from China.
Right.
Oh, I understand the criticism, but I also understand that in today's world, it's important to hear from people who have experience in world affairs and who have something to say that needs to be said. And in my last book, Seize the Moment, I try to do that. And I think it's very important that I do continue to do that. It would be easy for me to do like many other former officials, to spend my time relaxing, playing golf, playing bridge, and that sort of thing. But as far as I'm concerned, when I have so little time left, I want to use every minute of it sharing my views to the extent that they are useful with others. Whether they disagree with them or not, I think it's important now that we hear all the views we can possibly get so that we make the right decision.
It'll be a totally separate thing what the Buchanan factor will be.
Well, the two are very different people to begin with. They are both conservatives, or at least they claim to be conservatives. There's no question that Pat Buchanan is a true believing conservative. I don't know David Duke, but from what I read about him, he is out of the mainstream. He's not a Democrat, he's not a Republican, and I understand why some of the Republican chairmen don't even want him on the ballot. As a matter of fact, I think Massachusetts probably was correct in putting him on the ballot because it's best to knock him out running for the Republican nomination than to have him run as an independent. If he runs as an independent, he would siphon votes off, potentially, from our presidential candidate. Now let's look at Buchanan. I know him very well because, as you know, we've worked together for over 20 years. He is a passionate, true believing conservative. He is not a nut. He's not a racist. He's not anti-Semitic. He is very pro-American, and that makes him appear to be anti-others, anti-other countries. But it's more that he is pro-American. I would say that he's a man who feels so strongly that he'd rather be right than be president. And that's probably what's going to happen to him. On the other hand, in a state like New Hampshire, which is in recession, Buchanan will get over 40% of the vote. He will also make an impression in some of the other primaries. He will lose, and at the convention, he'll make a fine speech supporting President Bush because he will realize that the choice is not between President Bush and somebody better, but between President Bush and somebody much worse. And Buchanan will support him and be a very effective supporter.
So what's through the agony of these months? Is it just for that moment of glory then in New Hampshire where you can say I got 40% against an incumbent president?
No, Pat doesn't work that way. He believes in his conservative principles. He doesn't think the current administration represents those principles adequately. He believes that if he gets out there and campaigns for those principles, they will have to listen to him, and that he may be able to affect the platform and possibly the course of events in the next administration. That's why he's in it, and I think under those circumstances, you really can't criticize him for trying. But in the end, there's no question that he will be supporting the Bush-Quayle ticket enthusiastically because the choice will be something that he really cannot accept. Well, the Duke candidacy could have somewhat the same effect that the Wallace candidacy had on me in 1968. Wallace got about 10 to 12% of the vote. But polls indicated, because he was a conservative, that about 2 out of the 3 votes he got came from me rather than from Hubert Humphrey. It therefore made a race which otherwise would have been a small landslide. It made it very, very close. Now, in the case of Duke, he's not going to get, if he runs as an independent, 10 to 12%. He could get 3 to 4 to 5%. And in close states like California, Illinois, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, in close states, that could make a difference. Therefore, it's very important that Duke be knocked out early on. We don't want any part of him as far as accepting the fact that he is a Republican, because he isn't. He isn't a Republican. He isn't a Democrat. He's just for Duke. That's all.
Let's talk about touch with Mario Cuomo, even since he decided not to run. Why do you think he made that decision?
I expected him to run, but I think he looked at the situation in his own state. He felt that unless he could handle the budget problem there, that would be a liability which would run the risk of his not being able to run a good race for the presidency. Cuomo doesn't want to lose. We must remember that before he had his victories for governor on 2 occasions, that he had lost a couple of times. He doesn't want to lose again. I think he probably decided that, well, he's still young enough, he can make it next time. And so I think he'll be in the ring in '96. I think he would have been better advised probably to run, because of all of the Democratic candidates, he's the only heavyweight. The others, I would say, are either lightweights or at best middleweights, at least at this time. I would add, however, in effect, that will change. Once one of the Democrats is nominated, then he can get a very great lift from media steroids, because they will give him the lift and they can make a lightweight a heavyweight virtually overnight. So I think the Democratic nominee, whoever it is, in this period, assuming that the recession is still on, will run a good race, but Bush will win.
And even if it's done with smoke and mirrors, to at least give the impression that the recession is over. Am I inferring too much if I infer that you don't think that's going to happen?
No, I think the recession should be over, or at least a recovery should begin. Not a very strong recovery, but enough of a recovery so that the recession is not the issue that it is today. I think that should begin in the summer.
But even if the recession continues in a somewhat diminished form, you still think that President Bush is strong enough to beat any of the Democrats out there right now?
I do. It will be a close race, but he will win. He will win by winning all of the South. He will win all the South, incidentally, except for possibly a few border states, even if Clinton is nominated. And then he will pick up, in addition, some heartland states, Illinois and Ohio. California is going to be very tough for him. New York, Pennsylvania, these states will be very tough for him. But I see him winning due to, incidentally, something he's criticized for, that he's the only candidate in the field who is really a heavyweight. He's the only candidate in the field who knows foreign policy. Now, I know that all the polls show that people don't care about foreign policy, but they will. And President Bush should campaign on foreign and domestic policy, because he will demolish any of the Democratic opponents, all of whom are amateurs in foreign policy. They know very little about it, and most of them, what they do know is wrong. Well, I feel it's very important to keep the whole Japanese-American relationship in perspective. Now, let's just look at the two countries, what the stakes are. In the first place, between the two of us, Japan and the United States, with 8% of the people in the world, produce 40% of the world's wealth. If the two of us can work together, we can affect the course of events of the whole world for the next 10 years into the next century. It's very important that we recognize that we have common interests. We have common interests in another respect. We are both democracies. We are both for the free market. We are both committed to peace. We don't have designs on the other territorially or any other way. Having all those things in mind, we have to recognize that because we are the two strongest economies in the world, we're going to be competitive. We're going to have different... I can't be critical of the president on that, because he had to look at what the situation was insofar as his domestic policies are concerned, the criticism he was getting for spending all of this time in foreign policy and not enough on domestic policy, his concern about the recession. Whether he was right or not will depend upon what happens when he comes back, whether the polls go up or the polls go down.
You mean politically?
Politically. We're speaking of politically.
But I'm asking you as a foreign policy...
I think as far as the Japanese are concerned, as the Prime Minister indicated, they're aware of the fact that they've had a virtual free ride in the foreign policy area because of the U.S. commitment. And they expect some bashing. I think it's a mistake, however. I think Japan bashing on the part of the United States is a mistake. I think American bashing on the part of some Japanese, which, as you know, is developing at the present time, is a mistake. I think, too, that as far as our policy is concerned, we have to get some things straight. Let me demolish some of the myths. One, the myth that the Japanese policies on trade and so forth have caused the recession. That's not true. We would have had a recession whether we'd had any differences with Japan or not. The idea that Japan is now going to own most of America, there's no basis for that. They have a very strong economy. We have a very strong economy. I'd make another point, too, that when we talk about trade, I've looked at the numbers there a bit. If all of the non-tariff barriers, which are wrong, the Japanese have, if all of their other trade restrictions, which are wrong, particularly, for example, on rice, etc., if we got rid of all of them, as far as the trade deficit is concerned, which is about $60 billion a year, it would amount to only $8 to $10 billion a year in working on off that deficit. We have to look, in other words, to ourselves rather than just to the Japanese. We've got to bargain with them to get rid of their restrictions, but we got to get rid of some of ours as well. We're going to be better served by a policy of free and fair trade than one of trying to protect against each other.
I want to take another brief break, and when we come back, some of the views that you have about the Middle...
Well, I guess I can be pretty tough because I don't have to make the decisions. And I am sure that both of them had facts that were made available to them that may not have been made available to me. But I believe that my analysis is an honest one. I think it's a fair one. And I think in retrospect that both of them might reach the same conclusion.
That it was just not a smart thing to do, in either case.
Well, let's first look at the situation of helping Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war. We had to balance the situation there, and so that perhaps is a justification for that. As far as Iran is concerned, the idea that we're going to find some people in Iran who are going to be moderates is just pure nonsense. Here's a country that is engaged in over 400 terrorist incidents, and incidentally, it's still a terrorist state. There's no question about that.
You find that it's a little bit demeaning for the United States to be, in effect, thanking and congratulating both the Iranians and the Syrians for helping in the release of hostages.
Absolutely. You don't thank a kidnapper for returning the individual that he's kidnapped, particularly after you paid him off to an extent. No, I think that as far as that is concerned, they deserve no brownie points at all for returning hostages that they shouldn't have taken in the first place. No doubt about it. We have to understand that there's been some criticism of President Bush for not going further, for not continuing the war for a couple of more days and taking out Saddam Hussein and have him die in a bunker as Hitler had, since he compared him with Hitler. I understand why he didn't. The reason that he didn't is that he had at the outset enlisted the Congress and also enlisted the Allies for one purpose, and that was to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Once that was accomplished, the concept of a just war would not allow him to carry the war further. But now, at this time, in the event that Saddam Hussein stiffs the UN, doesn't allow inspection, and if we have good evidence, hard evidence, that he is going forward with chemical or nuclear or any other kind of weapons, no doubt we should go in after a warning and bomb it. I would say that I find it really revolting that the Kuwaiti royal family, after all of the money that has been spent and the lives that have been lost in order to save their country, that they have made no progress whatever that I can see insofar as political reform is concerned. The American people are very idealistic. We fight our wars, we hope, to success, to victory. But we also have to be urged on. We have to be inspired by ideals. And to fight a war, to put back on the throne a regime that denies civil rights, that doesn't even make any attempt to move toward democracy, is something that most Americans are repelled by.